You don't have to worry about Mom, Emily said softly, and the way she said it made my hands go cold. It was just a Sunday dinner, the kind we'd had 100 times before, roast chicken in the oven, green beans with slivered almonds, Daniel carving at the kitchen island, while Emily poured wine into glasses that caught the light from the chandelier. I arrived at 5 sharp, like I always do, carrying a peach cobbler I'd baked that afternoon in my small ranch-style home 15 miles across town. The house smelled of rosemary and lemon, warm and welcoming. And when Emily kissed my cheek, she lingered just a second too long. Her smile stretched thin and perfect. Daniel hugged me, but his arms felt distracted, as if his mind were still somewhere else. We sat at the long oak table they bought last spring, the one Emily said would be better for hosting. They asked about my week. I told them about the hydrangeas finally blooming along my fence and how I'd replaced the batteries in the smoke detectors myself. Emily laughed lightly and said, "See, you're still independent," and I couldn't quite tell if it was praise or something else. Daniel refilled my glass before it was empty. He kept glancing at Emily, waiting for cues the way he used to wait for me to nod when he was a boy unsure of his answers. The conversation drifted to real estate prices rising in our county, to stories of older neighbors who had decided to downsize, a word Emily repeated as if testing how it sounded in the room. I kept my face calm. I cut my chicken into careful pieces. I've learned over 72 years that silence can reveal more than questions ever will. After dessert, I stood and said I didn't want to keep them from their evening. Emily insisted I stay for coffee, but her eyes flickered toward Daniel again, and something in that small exchange told me I was right to leave. I hugged my son. I told Emily thank you for dinner. I stepped out into the cool night air and walked to my Buick parked along the curb under a maple tree just beginning to turn for fall. Halfway down the driveway, I realized I'd left my cardigan on the back of the dining chair. I turned back quietly, the porch, light casting a pale circle on the concrete. The front door was still slightly ajar. I heard Emily's heels click against the hardwood floor. I heard Daniel exhale. Then I heard my name. "We just need her to sign first," Emily said, her voice lower now, stripped of its honeyed edges. There was a pause, heavy and deliberate. Daniel didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his tone was hesitant. "And you're sure this is the only way?" Emily replied, "She trusts you. It'll be simple. Once it's done, everything falls into place." I stood frozen in the shadow of the entryway, my hand inches from the door, my heart beating not fast but steady, like a clock that has decided to mark time carefully. They were still smiling when I left. I had seen it, but this was the truth behind the smiles. I picked up my cardigan without making a sound and stepped back into the night before they could see me, the cool air sharper now against my skin. And for the first time that evening I understood that whatever paper they wanted me to sign was not a kindness, not a convenience, but the beginning of something they believed I would never suspect. I did not drive home right away. I sat in my Buick with the engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at the soft glow from Daniel's living room window. Through the sheer curtains I could see their silhouettes moving back and forth, calm and ordinary, as if nothing had shifted in the world. My heart was not racing. That surprised me. It was steady, deliberate, like it had decided to conserve its strength. I have lived in the same 3-bedroom ranch house for 41 years. I survived my husband's heart attack. I learned how to balance the checkbook when he was too sick to sit at the kitchen table. I replaced garbage disposals and patched drywall, and paid property taxes on time every single year. I did not survive all of that to be described as something that needed to sign first. The drive home took 20 minutes. The radio played softly, some old country song about lost love and dusty roads, but I barely heard it. My mind replayed her voice instead. "We just need her to sign first. Not we should talk to her. Not we should ask her opinion. Just sign." When I pulled into my driveway, the porch light I had left on for myself felt different, almost like a witness. Inside, my house was quiet in the way only a house can be when it knows its owner's footsteps. I hung my cardigan on the hook by the door and stood still for a moment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the wall clock in the hallway. Everything was exactly where I had left it. Nothing had fallen apart. That steadiness grounded me. I poured myself a glass of water instead of wine and sat at my kitchen table, the same oak table my husband and I bought from a hardware store clearance sale in 1989. I folded my hands and allowed the evening to settle into place. Downsize. Independent. Sign first. The words lined up neatly now, no longer random comments, but pieces of something planned. Emily had mentioned a neighbor moving into a senior community last month. Daniel had asked whether I still felt comfortable driving at night. Last week, he offered to help me review my bills, said it would make him feel better to know everything was organized. At the time I thought it was concern. Now I understood it as preparation. I stood and walked to the small desk in my den where I keep my documents in a locked file cabinet. I did not open it yet. I simply rested my hand on the cool metal handle. If there were papers they wanted signed, they would come soon enough. I needed to know what they believed I did not know. I needed to see how far they were willing to go. I turned off the kitchen lights one by one and made my way to the bedroom. On my nightstand sits a framed photograph of Daniel at 8 years old, missing his front teeth, holding a fishing rod far too big for his small hands. I touched the frame lightly. He used to look at me for every answer. Tonight, he looked at her. I did not cry. Tears would have blurred the edges of what I needed to see clearly. Instead, I lay down and stared at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me, thinking not about betrayal, but about timing. They believed I trusted them completely. They were right. I had. But trust, once cracked, does not shatter loudly. It changes shape. And as I closed my eyes, I made a quiet decision that whatever document they placed in front of me, I would read every word twice, and I would be ready long before they realized I was no longer the easiest signature in the room. The next morning I woke before the alarm clock, long before the sun had fully risen over the maple tree in my front yard. For a moment I lay still, listening to the quiet hum of the house, letting the events of the previous night settle into something solid and manageable. I did not allow myself the comfort of pretending I had misunderstood. I have reached an age where instincts are not dramatic, they are precise. I rose, made my bed with the same careful corners I have kept for decades, and walked into the kitchen to brew coffee. The scent filled the air, steady and familiar, and I found comfort in the ritual. At 8:15, my phone rang. I looked at the screen before answering. Emily. Her timing was almost impressive. I let it ring twice more before I picked up. Her voice flowed through the receiver bright and smooth, asking how I slept, telling me again how lovely it had been to have me over. I thanked her and kept my tone even. There was a small pause, then she moved toward it gently. She said she and Daniel had been talking about ways to make things easier for everyone in the future. She mentioned how much paperwork can pile up as we get older. She said they worried about me handling everything alone. I stirred my coffee slowly and let her speak. Then she suggested that Daniel stop by later in the week with some documents. Nothing urgent, just something that would help streamline things. She used the word streamline twice. I asked what kind of documents. She replied that it was mostly about ensuring Daniel could assist with financial matters if I ever needed help. Just a precaution, something responsible families do. I could almost hear her smile through the line. I thanked her for thinking ahead and said I would be happy to look at anything they brought. My voice did not shake. When we hung up, I placed the phone down carefully and finished my coffee. Without rushing. The pieces were aligning exactly as I expected. By mid-morning, I drove to the bank branch where I have kept my accounts for over 30 years. The building had been remodeled recently, all glass panels and polished floors, but the manager, Mr. Reynolds, still recognized me. We sat in his office, and I asked him to review every account with me, every beneficiary designation, every authorization on file. He printed copies. He explained terms in detail. I listened closely, not because I was confused, but because I wanted to hear the language that might appear in the documents Daniel would bring. From there I drove across town to a small law office recommended by a neighbor from church. The waiting room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and paper. I scheduled a consultation for the following afternoon. I did not tell Daniel or Emily. When I returned home, I opened my locked file cabinet and reviewed my deed, my will, my insurance policies. Everything was intact. Everything was in my name, exactly as my husband and I had intended. I placed the documents back in order and closed the drawer. They believed they were planning something careful and strategic. They believed I would sign without question because I always had faith in my son. What they did not know was that I was no longer walking into their conversation unaware. I was stepping into it prepared, with my eyes open and my signature no longer automatic. The following afternoon I sat in a modest office across from a woman named Linda Harper, an estate attorney with silver hair cut neatly at her jaw and reading glasses that rested low on her nose. Her office walls were lined with framed certificates and shelves of thick legal books that looked heavy with other family stories. I explained that I wanted a review of my current will and any vulnerabilities I might not see. I did not dramatize the situation. I simply said that my son and daughter-in-law had expressed interest in helping manage my finances and that I wished to understand exactly what that could mean. She listened without interruption, her pen moving steadily across a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she asked one question that lingered in the air longer than the others. She asked whether I felt pressured. I answered honestly that I felt observed. That seemed to tell her enough. She walked me through the differences between granting limited power of attorney and full financial control. She explained how easily broad language in a document could shift authority in ways that are difficult to reverse. She described living trusts, revocable and irrevocable, and how assets could be structured to protect independence while still ensuring clarity for the future. I listened carefully, not because I was frightened, but because knowledge steadies me. By the end of the meeting, I had decided to make changes, not drastic ones, but deliberate ones. I instructed her to draft a revocable living trust that would place my home and primary accounts under its protection with me as sole trustee for as long as I remained competent. I also requested a clause requiring independent medical confirmation before any determination of incapacity could trigger outside control. Linda nodded approvingly. She said preparation is not suspicion, it is wisdom. When I stepped outside, the late afternoon sun warmed the pavement, and I felt something close to relief. Not relief that my son had disappointed me, but relief that I had not disappointed myself. 2 days later, Daniel called and said he would come by Saturday morning with the documents they had mentioned. His tone was casual, almost rehearsed. He added that Emily had done research online and found templates that many families use. I agreed and told him 10 o'clock would be fine. That Saturday, I woke early again, brewed coffee, and arranged my kitchen table neatly. I placed a simple blue folder beside my seat, the one containing copies of the updated trust documents Linda had prepared. I did not plan to reveal them immediately. I wanted to see what Daniel would place in front of me first. At exactly 10:02, his truck pulled into my driveway. I watched through the front window as he stepped out holding a slim leather portfolio. He looked older than I remembered from just days ago, the weight of something pressing behind his polite smile. When he entered, he hugged me briefly and commented on how tidy the house looked, as if he were assessing it with new eyes. He laid the portfolio on the table and opened it carefully. Inside were several printed pages clipped together. He began explaining that this was simply a precaution to allow him to assist with bills if I ever became overwhelmed. He spoke in a steady voice, but he did not quite meet my eyes. I nodded and reached for the papers, turning them slowly, reading each paragraph in full. The language was broader than precaution. It granted authority not only to review accounts, but to manage, transfer, and make decisions on my behalf without immediate oversight. I looked up at my son and offered a small, thoughtful smile. I told him I appreciated his concern and that I believed in planning ahead. Then I said I would need time to review everything thoroughly before signing anything. His shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. He had expected something simpler. What he did not yet realize was that I had already stepped several moves ahead. Daniel did not argue when I told him I needed time, but disappointment flickered across his face before he could hide it. He gathered the papers slowly, as if reconsidering whether to leave them behind, then said he could come back next weekend if that worked better for me. I told him that would be fine and walked him to the door with the same steady calm I had carried all week. When his truck disappeared down the street, I did not feel triumph. I felt clarity. Inside, I sat again at my kitchen table and replayed every word he had used. Assist, simplify, protect. The language sounded caring, yet the document had been anything but small. It would have given him the authority to move funds, sell property, and make binding financial decisions without requiring my signature again. That is not assistance. That is transfer. Later that afternoon, Emily called. Her voice was lighter than usual, almost rehearsed. She asked how the meeting had gone and whether Daniel had explained everything clearly. I said he had. She asked if I had signed. I told her I believed in reading every document carefully before committing to it. There was a pause long enough for me to imagine her expression on the other end. Then she said she respected that and added that sometimes older paperwork can become confusing and that families who plan early avoid unnecessary complications. I thanked her for her concern and ended the call politely. Afterward, I drove to Linda Harper's office to sign the finalized trust documents we had prepared. The process was simple and formal. 2 witnesses observed my signature. Linda notarized the pages and handed me certified copies in a sealed envelope. I felt no anger as I placed them carefully into my leather briefcase. I felt steadiness. That evening I returned home and stored the originals in a fireproof lockbox in my bedroom closet. I replaced the deed copy in my file cabinet with the updated trust paperwork and organized everything neatly. I wanted no confusion in my own records. On Wednesday, Daniel stopped by unannounced in the early evening. He said he had been in the neighborhood and thought he would check on me. I invited him in and offered coffee. He looked around the living room as though measuring something unseen. He commented on the stairs to the basement, asking whether they felt steeper than they used to. He asked whether I ever worried about slipping in winter. I answered calmly that I had installed new railings and that I had managed the steps for decades without incident. He nodded but did not seem satisfied. Before leaving, he asked again whether I had made progress reviewing the documents. I told him I had scheduled my own legal consultation to better understand them. That caught him off guard. He tried to mask it with a smile, but I saw the calculation behind his eyes. He asked what the attorney had advised. I said she had advised that independence is best preserved when decisions are made deliberately, not quickly. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he stared at the hardwood floor for a moment before saying he only wanted what was best for me. I believed he meant that in some distant way, but I also knew that what he believed was best might not include my full control. After he left, I stood at my front window again, watching his truck reverse down the driveway. They had expected hesitation, perhaps confusion. What they received was patience. And patience, when combined with preparation, becomes something far stronger than suspicion. It becomes strategy. By Thursday evening, I understood that waiting would not make them retreat. It would only make them adjust. Emily sent a message suggesting we all have dinner again on Sunday, this time at my house. She wrote that it would be nice to spend time together in my space for a change. I read the message twice before replying that I would be delighted to host. If they wanted to measure the foundation beneath me, I would let them step fully inside. Saturday morning, I cleaned in a way that was not about dust, but about dignity. I polished the oak table until it reflected the light from the window. I arranged fresh flowers from my yard in a glass vase at the center. I placed the blue folder containing a copy of my trust documents inside the drawer of the buffet within easy reach. I was not preparing for confrontation. I was preparing for clarity. Sunday arrived bright and cool, the kind of autumn afternoon that makes the air feel honest. They pulled into my driveway at 4:30. Emily stepped out first, carrying a bottle of wine and smiling as though nothing had ever passed between us beyond polite conversation. Daniel followed with a container of salad. He hugged me longer than usual, perhaps to reassure himself. Inside, they complimented the house in a tone that felt observational rather than affectionate. Emily ran her fingers lightly along the mantel where family photographs stood arranged by year. She paused at one of Daniel in his high school graduation gown. She smiled and said time moves so quickly. I agreed. Over dinner, the conversation was careful. Emily asked about my appointment with the attorney, keeping her voice casual. I told her it had been informative. Daniel focused on his plate, cutting his food into precise pieces. I could see the question hovering in both of them. Had I signed their document yet? When dessert was served, Emily set down her fork and leaned back in her chair. She said she had brought an updated version of the paperwork Daniel had shown me, something clearer and more streamlined. The word again. She retrieved a folder from her purse and placed it gently on the table as if it were a gift. I looked at it without touching it. Daniel began explaining that this revision addressed any concerns I might have had, and that it simply ensured he could act quickly if there were ever an emergency. I let him finish without interruption. Then I stood, walked calmly to the buffet, and returned with my own folder. I placed it beside theirs. I told them that I appreciated their initiative and that I too believed in being prepared. I explained that after thoughtful review, I had established a trust to protect my assets while maintaining full control. I said that any future assistance would require clearly defined limitations and independent oversight. The silence that followed was not loud, but it was unmistakable. Emily's smile tightened. Daniel's shoulders dropped slightly, as if he had reached the end of a path he expected to be shorter. I did not accuse them. I did not raise my voice. I simply stated that I would not be signing broad authority documents, and that any decisions about my home or finances would remain mine unless I chose otherwise. I watched their expressions shift from confidence to recalculation. In that moment, I realized something important. They had come expecting agreement. Instead, they found structure. And structure, unlike suspicion, does not waver when tested. Emily recovered first. She always did. Her smile returned, softer now, but thinner at the edges. She said it was wonderful that I had taken initiative and that it proved exactly why planning ahead matters. Daniel nodded quickly beside her, as though agreement could smooth over the shift that had just taken place at my dining table. I poured coffee for all three of us and sat down again, keeping my hands steady around the warm ceramic mug. I told them I wanted transparency in our family. I said that if they ever had concerns about my well-being or my ability to manage my affairs, I preferred they speak to me directly rather than design solutions around me. The words were gentle, but they did not bend. Daniel cleared his throat and said they had only been thinking long-term. He mentioned rising healthcare costs and how quickly situations can change at my age. I listened without interrupting. Then I asked a simple question. I asked when they had first begun researching power of attorney documents. The silence that followed felt heavier than any raised voice. Emily answered that she had read an article online a few months ago about families being unprepared. She said it planted the idea. I nodded slowly and reminded them that I have managed my own finances for decades, that my mortgage was paid off 10 years ago, that my credit score remained excellent, and that my bills had never once been late. I did not say this to boast. I said it to establish fact. Daniel's expression shifted from defensiveness to something closer, to discomfort. He admitted that he had called a local attorney 2 weeks earlier to ask general questions about guardianship procedures. He insisted it was only informational. I looked at him steadily and told him I would have appreciated being part of that information. Emily reached for his hand under the table, a small protective gesture. She said they worried about what might happen if I had a fall or became confused. I reminded her calmly that worry is not the same as evidence. I also told them that any future discussion about my health would involve my physician, not assumptions made across a dinner table. The air in the room changed after that. It was no longer about paperwork. It was about boundaries. I stood and began clearing plates, not because the conversation was over, but because I had said what needed saying. Daniel rose to help me in the kitchen. Away from Emily, his voice dropped. He asked if I was angry. I told him anger was not the word. I told him I was attentive. He looked at the floor tiles for a moment and said he had never intended to make me feel replaced in my own life. That word lingered between us. Replaced. I told him that independence is not a phase that expires at 72. It is a habit built over years, and it does not disappear simply because someone else is ready to manage it. When they finally left that evening, there was no dramatic exit, no slammed doors. Just a careful goodbye and a promise to talk soon. I watched their car pull away from the curb as I had done so many times before, but this time the distance between us felt measured, not emotional, but deliberate. Inside, I returned to the dining room and sat alone at the polished oak table. The flowers in the center still stood upright, steady and bright. I realized then that what had begun as a quiet discovery outside their front door had become something larger. It was no longer about a signature. It was about understanding that respect must remain mutual, even as roles shift with age. And that evening, for the first time since I overheard them, I felt certain that the balance had tilted back into my hands. Monday morning arrived quieter than the rest. No calls, no messages. The silence itself felt intentional, as though they were recalculating behind closed doors. I did not fill that silence with worry. Instead, I followed my usual routine. I watered the hydrangeas along the fence, checked the mail, and reviewed my monthly budget at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a sharpened pencil. The numbers lined up cleanly, predictable, and steady. By noon, however, Daniel's name appeared on my phone screen. I let it ring once before answering. His voice was careful, stripped of the confidence he carried the week before. He said he had been thinking about our conversation and that he realized they may have approached things too quickly. He said Emily felt embarrassed if she had overstepped. I listened without interrupting. When he paused, I told him that embarrassment fades, but trust requires maintenance. I said I needed him to understand something clearly. I told him that I overheard part of their conversation the night I left their house early. The line went completely silent. Not a breath. Not a shuffle. Then he asked quietly what I had heard. I repeated the words exactly as they had been spoken. We just need her to sign first. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply delivered the sentence as fact. Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound heavy with recognition. He said it was not meant the way it sounded. He said they had been discussing logistics, not control. I told him intent matters less than impact. I explained that hearing myself reduced to a signature shifted something inside me. I said I would not be managed like a project. He did not argue this time. Instead, he admitted that they had assumed I would agree because I always trusted him. That word again. Trusted. I told him trust is not a blank check. It is a shared responsibility. Later that evening, Emily called separately. Her tone was softer than I had ever heard it. She apologized if her words had seemed calculating. She said she feared being unprepared, and that fear can sound like strategy. I considered that carefully. Fear does shape decisions. But fear does not justify exclusion. I told her that if she wanted to be part of my future planning, she needed to include me from the beginning, not after a plan was drafted. There was a long pause before she agreed. The following Sunday, they invited me to dinner again, this time with no mention of documents. I accepted. When I arrived, the table was set simply. No folders, no portfolios, just plates and silverware and the quiet awareness that something had changed. During the meal, Daniel asked about my garden. Emily complimented the trust structure I had described, saying it sounded wise. I noticed she did not use the word streamline once. At one point, Daniel looked directly at me and said he was proud that I remained so capable. It was not a grand statement, but it felt unforced. I nodded and told him capability does not disappear with age. It evolves. As I drove home that night, the road ahead looked the same as always, lined with streetlights and familiar houses. Yet I felt lighter, not because conflict had vanished, but because it had been named. They now understood that I heard them. More importantly, they understood that I would respond not with anger, but with preparation. And sometimes preparation speaks louder than any raised voice ever could. 3 weeks passed without another mention of paperwork. The calls became ordinary again. Updates about grocery sales, about a neighbor who had painted his house the wrong shade of blue, about Daniel's long hours at work. On the surface, everything looked restored. But restoration is not the same as forgetting. I did not bring up that night outside their door again. I did not need to. The knowledge had already reshaped the foundation beneath our conversations. One afternoon, Daniel stopped by alone. He carried no folder this time, only a bag of apples from a farm stand 20 miles north of town. He set them on my counter and said he remembered how I used to bake pies in October. I smiled and told him I still do. We stood side by side in the kitchen, the late sunlight filtering through the curtains, and for a moment, he looked like the boy who once waited for my approval after every school project. He said he had been thinking about responsibility. He admitted that when he first discussed the documents with Emily, he saw it as stepping into the role of protector. He said he forgot that I had been protecting him long before he understood what protection meant. I listened quietly. Then I told him something simple. I told him that protection without permission feels like control, and control without conversation feels like erasure. He absorbed that without arguing. Later that evening, after he left, I walked through my house slowly, touching familiar surfaces as though seeing them with new eyes. The hallway where pencil marks still show how tall Daniel grew each year. The living room window where I stood the night I overheard their plan. The file cabinet that now holds documents prepared on my terms. Nothing about the structure had changed, yet I felt different moving through it. I felt aware. Not suspicious. Not hardened. Just aware. A few days later, Emily invited me to lunch at a small cafe downtown. She arrived early and stood when I entered, her expression less guarded than before. Over soup and iced tea, she said she had underestimated how quickly her words could travel beyond intention. She admitted she had viewed my independence as temporary rather than permanent. I told her independence is not a stage of life. It is a principle. We spoke calmly, without accusation. For the first time since that Sunday dinner weeks ago, I sensed sincerity rather than strategy. When we parted, she hugged me in a way that felt less rehearsed. That night, I locked my front door as I always do and paused for a moment in the quiet entryway. I realized that the greatest shift had not been in them. It had been in me. I no longer assumed that love guaranteed alignment. I understood that even within family, clarity must be spoken, not implied. The power I regained was not in the trust documents or the legal clauses. It was in the choice to respond with preparation instead of panic. They smiled at me that first evening, believing I would never hear what came after. They were wrong. I heard enough to change how I moved forward. And sometimes that is all a woman needs. Not revenge, not distance, just the steady certainty that her voice remains her own, her signature remains deliberate, and her place at the table is never dependent on someone else's quiet plan.